Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Berger.
And today we're exploring the origins of Seattle's literary scene. The first library here was built in 1868, even before the city was officially incorporated. And this is largely thanks to influential pioneers Henry and Sarah Yesler, who were, it turns out, not only unconventional for their time in many ways, but also instrumental in the creation of one of the world's great novelists.
Library, pot one, take one,
and action.
If you haven't seen the video, take a moment to watch it. It will put this conversation in context, and you'll see some of the first books on Seattle library shelves. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, let's turn a page. Knut, as a young person, as a young student, the library was a wonderland to me, and I'm pretty sure the same was true for you, right?
Yes. I mean, I was lucky enough to grow up in a household that had lots of books, and I was looking at books and magazines, all the way along. But I had a hard time learning to read in school. Dick and Jane readers and things like that were just so boring.
You were ahead of your time.
Well, I was one of those kids that every report card said, disturbs others, needs improvement. I was...
That's the same thing on my report cards.
Yeah.
Needs more of his share of attention.
And look at us now.
Yeah.
So one kind of major library experience was our neighborhood library was a Carnegie Library in Columbia City, which is still there, beautifully preserved. Mm-hmm. It's even been expanded, but it has the feel as it did when I was a kid. My mother would take us there and we would check out books. But the smell of the place, the smell of the books, the smell of the oak furniture, the heavy oak desks and chairs.
The card catalogs.
The quietness of it and the light coming through, it was a wonderful experience. I loved going to the library. And then I had a really great experience in sixth grade. I went to John Muir Elementary School, and there was a school library. And it wasn't a big thing. It was like classroom size, full of books. Our librarian was an amazing educator woman, Roberta Bird Barr. She's became very well known.
Very.
So I thought, well, what is it that I really want to do? And that's to teach.
She was on television and all kinds of stuff.
My name is Roberta Bird. The name of the program, Face to Face.
Well, she was our school librarian. And when I was in fifth and sixth grade, I sort of discovered the school library. She was wonderful and welcoming, and something triggered, especially when I was in sixth grade. I stumbled across a series of these, biographies for young people. Mm-hmm. And so it was, Thomas Edison, Jim Thorpe, various figures from history, sports, Babe Ruth, Wyatt Earp, this kind of thing. And I just could not stop reading mm-hmm. these. I just ran through them, so much so that in a very unlikely situation, I was invited to make a book report presentation to the PTA talking about my favorite figures in history and my favorite biography, because turned out I had read the most biographies of any kid at John Muir that year. And from then on, I was just a very, very avid reader. And I don't know what it was developmentally, whether I was just bored or my mother took me in to see if I was dyslexic or had some thing. They said, no, he's fine.
Well, it's amazing to think about how Roberta Bird Barr could have inspired many, many other students like you. That's why she is so revered in our city's history. I had the same experience. We were a family of readers. We were encouraged to read. I devoured the World Book Encyclopedia set almost as soon as it got there from, every single volume. But I do remember going to the Bellingham Library, especially on Saturday mornings, because I wanted to find the latest issue of Aviation Week and Space Technology, because after my Tom Swift days, I was really into planes and aviation and space travel, and that was a very expensive magazine. You couldn't take it out of the room, but it was just one of the wonders of the library. Well, Seattle is known as a literary city. We read a lot of books. We have a lot of bookstores, as well as a great library system. It's a UNESCO City of Literature, but I wasn't aware that the city's literary history started so soon after it was founded. Was that a surprise to you when you started leafing through the pages of history?
Well, it was. So I got interested in it as a specific topic when David Brewster, a man I used to work for at Seattle Weekly and Eastside Week and Sasquatch Publishing, he started, or was one of the catalysts for starting this Seattle Athenaeum, which is a private library, and lots of cities, Boston and Philadelphia, ever since the time of Ben Franklin, libraries used to be a private thing. So wealthy people would kick in dues. They would collect books. For some people, it was kind of like a club. There's a fabulous one in San Francisco. And so I was sort of interested in he's starting this library. It was in the downtown YMCA when it started. Now it's at the Pike Place Market. So I thought, well, what was the history, our history of libraries? And this traces back to what you mentioned, which is in the 1860s. About 10 years or so after the settlement came to Elliott Bay, the locals decided to start an Athenaeum, basically a private library, because this growing, budding, rough-hewn community needed some civilizing influences, I think is the best way to put it. And there were a small group of people who began to, pay money so that they could acquire books. And, the idea wasn't that they would have books to read and loan out, but they would be they would have authors come and talk or other speakers come. And the Yeslers were sort of central to that. So Henry Yesler came to Seattle in the early 1850s, not long after the Denny's got here. He brought with him a steam sawmill, which they put together, and it was really the first industry here. And one of the first gathering places in Seattle was the Yeslers' cookhouse, which was attached to the sawmill that was built at the bottom of what we call Yesler Way, then called Mill Street. People would come to the cookhouse and they would have Sunday services there, or they would have public talks. So it took a while. Yesler was here on his own. He married an indigenous Duwamish woman, and married, I guess, is sort of a question, but they had a partner and had a daughter by this woman. And his wife, Sarah, was still back in Massillon, Ohio, which is where Henry Yesler had come from. And she didn't come out for another 6 or 7 years. But when she came out, she added to this sort of growing number of white women who were settling in Seattle. And she, because she was a key figure, she cooked at the cookhouse. She worked in the business with Henry. And this was the main industry in town. She became sort of a center of promoting civic affairs.
Did Sarah promote the library then? Was she?
Yeah.
Did she become the sort of head librarian? And
she was one of the main organizers of the library. Yeah, and so they established this library, and as you mentioned, prior to official incorporation of the city of Seattle, it was also prior to the first plumbed bathroom in town. So you can see what the civilizing priorities were, books over
what's
baths.
more important?
Yeah. And, so the Yeslers became this very important civic influence. And one of the intriguing things about that is both their civic contribution to sort of the growth of Seattle, the civilizing of the city, but also their unconventionality. These were really different drummer people in terms of what their beliefs were, how they went about life. So the civic involvement was very important in certain areas. In other areas, they tended to kind of ignore it. You have to remember the city was a very rough and tumble place. The workforce was largely male. It was itinerant. You had bordellos, you had saloons. These were loggers, these were fishermen, these were mill workers. But you also had growing prosperity and other people coming in and developing the city. And I think there was a yearning, fairly early on that we want this to be a big city. Remember New York Alki, New York someday, aspirations to be a big city, a sense of competition with Tacoma, with San Francisco, Victoria. We want to be this big major player. And I think there was an awareness that to get there and to make money, you had to tame the city somewhat. And that happened in different stages, but certainly having a means of uplifting people morally and intellectually was part of that. The interesting thing to me, or there are many interesting parts of it, but first of all, the Yeslers were free thinkers, which meant they didn't go to church. They didn't buy into Christian dogma. And this was looked askance by other people who were, wanting to civilize the city with churches and that kind of. Seattle's not a particularly big church-going town. It never has been. It was not founded by missionaries. And I think the Yeslers, you could say, were tolerant of other people's Christianity, but they were given a pass for not attending church or engaging in that. And so I think the library provided a kind of broader intellectual field of engagement than simply reading the Bible, attending church on Sunday, and having your thoughts in a very kind of narrow channel by comparison.
Did the first books in the library, whether they're donated or bought with, quote, library dues, reflect that broadness? What were the first books?
So I came across a ledger at the Seattle Public Library in their special collections, and it was one of the later versions of the first library. So it went through a number of iterations and locations, but we have a ledger from 1889, handwritten, that lists the books in that version of it, which was still a private library at that point. And the first 10 books, almost all of them anyway, are books that were in print at the time of the original order. They had to send away to San Francisco for books at that time. Seattle didn't have a bookstore. So Bancroft stationers in San Francisco, they would get books from back east and they could ship them up to Puget Sound. So I suspect they were in that first library. And they're all aimed at either giving advice, especially to young people, about how to grow up to be gentlemen and gentle ladies. They are books of kind of wisdom and books on moral character and books on homemaking. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a whole series of books about the modern housewife, the modern home. She was kind of one of the foremost writers on that topic in that Victorian period. And so the books all have, for the most part, have this sort of moral uplift. Oliver Wendell Holmes' Autocrat at the Breakfast Table, and books like that where they're full of aphorisms and wisdom. And there's one book that's on that list that speaks to the Yeslers' unconventionality. So you're reading about these books by Edward Eggleston, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Harriet Beecher Stowe. I guess you had to have three names back in the day. And then you come to this book called The Gates Ajar. This is the 9th or 10th book on the list. And this is actually a very controversial book at the time it was published in the late 1860s. And it did become a bestseller. It sold like 80,000 copies, but it was also a very controversial book. it has a root in promoting a kind of view of the afterlife that is both a kind of idealized view of Victorian middle classness, but at the same time, the book was considered blasphemous. So we know Henry Yesler and Sarah Yesler were so-called freethinkers. They didn't belong to a church. They didn't go to church. But they were also into spiritualism. And they were into other things, too. I mean, Sarah was a suffragist. She promoted women's suffrage and women's rights from the day she arrived. We know they had some unconventional aspects to their personal relationship. We know from correspondence that Sarah Yesler wrote that she had a very intimate relationship with another woman, and possibly two women. And then Henry had, this connection with the indigenous wife and daughter. And they zagged in other ways, too. Henry Yesler was very protective of, and Sarah, very protective during the uprising against Chinese, the exclusion of Chinese in Seattle in the 1880s. Was very much against that exclusion, which put him at odds with a lot of powerful forces in town. And this gets us to this other contribution that they made, which wasn't necessarily intentional, but was the result of their unconventionality and to some degree of their literary and civic aspirations and free-thinkingness.
Henry and Sarah are very unconventional then. Did they have to hide this whole personal life? Did other people know about their relationships and some of their beliefs?
Well, I think Henry had the virtue of being the power guy in Seattle.
Because he was wealthy.
Well, he became wealthy. He had real estate. He had multiple mills. He had the most successful industry, the first and most successful industry in Seattle. So it's not like he could be easily cast aside. And he's married to a very powerful, civic-minded woman. But another aspect to it is that I think you could consider them spiritualists. Spiritualism was one of many kind of religious or semi-religious systems of belief that flourished in sort of the early 19th century. So, there's a period of time when you have theosophy is popping up, Mormonism is popping up. People are beginning to get exposed to ideas from India, Hinduism, Buddhism. And one of the most powerful of those was spiritualism. And this was a belief that the biblical or Christian sense of the afterlife was not correct. So in that sense, by many people, was considered blasphemous. And this is the period where you begin to have seances, where people believe, when people are dead, they're not in heaven, they're in a heaven that will allow them to communicate with the living. And this became a very powerful movement. It was in Europe as well as the United States. Emanuel Swedenborg and the Swedenborgians were also kind of on the rise, and that was sort of a Christianized version of this. But there was this belief that you could talk to spirits and the spirits of your family. And so you begin to get mediums, seances, experiences where people get together and contact people in the hereafter. And the Yeslers were into that.
When was this very prevalent?
It came to the fore kind of in the period before the Civil War, 1840s, 1850s. It gained momentum because of the Civil War, because there was so much loss.
Death.
And of course, it's not like many people had large families of which only a few reached adulthood. The Yeslers lost a son young. So you had people dealing with those losses, but then you add the war to that, where there's all these sons mostly dying, and spiritualism, I think, really took off during the 1860s, 1870s into the 1880s, before a period of skepticism begins to really step in.
So a way to deal with death and to grieve and to have a connection with that.
Yes.
With those losses.
And that's why I'm so intrigued by this book, The Gates Ajar, that's on this early library, whether it was in the original library or it showed up in the 1880s. It's a controversial book, a book considered blasphemous, but the premise of the book is a spiritualist premise, which is that heaven is an idealized Victorian life where your relatives are happy and wandering around and can talk to you. You can connect with them. You don't have to worry about them. And so this is contrary to when you think about, the Christian dogmas about heaven and about hell, about the truth of the Bible, the literalness of the Bible. This is very controversial in that context. In the spiritualist context, it's a world that makes an afterlife that makes perfect sense. So this gets us to the sort of their other unintentional literary contribution. First of all, they took in a boarder at one point, Flora Wellman, who was from the same hometown they were from, and they were friends of her family. And she was a kind of free-thinking spiritualist gal who did not want to follow in the sort of traditional path that her parents had for her. And she ended up leaving home, moving to Seattle, and boarding at the Yeslers. She was a music and elocution teacher. She was, very unconventional in her ideas. We know that when she lived with the Yeslers, she participated in seances. And we also know from her history after that, after she moved out, what she became involved in. So the Yeslers took in another boarder, a man who was a house guest, William Cheney. And he was an itinerant astrologer, among other things. That doesn't really kind of do him credit, but he was a spiritualist. Now we would say this is a New Age thinker. He was anti-Catholic. He had been a know-nothing, actually, back in those days. But he was also very anti-Christian. And he said, look, the Bible is BS. It's not history. It's not literal. It's made up. And he became sort of the foremost American astrologer, and he wrote books on astrology. He also conducted seances.
Of course.
So he's living with the Yeslers. He's living with the Flora Wellman. He's traveling around the country giving lectures. He tries to set up a spiritualist college in Oregon at some point. And these things are recorded in newspapers and other things, his career.
So William Cheney is the kind of person, first of all, I was thinking this wave of spiritualism opens the doors for the traveling lecturers, so much opportunity and profit to be made. So he's the kind of guy who would have, big talk show now, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because he was leading a pretty marginal existence as an itinerant astrologer. There wasn't a lot of business in that. But, you could go from small town to small town. You could, throw up a bunch of posters, give some lectures, make a little money, and then move on. He was obsessive, though, as a practitioner of astrology. And he saw a lot, through that lens. And actually came across a newspaper clipping critiquing him. And this was published in the Puget Sound Dispatch, so a local newspaper, but they're picking up an item from a San Francisco paper where he had passed through. I'll just read quickly the headline. Humbug rampant. The Right Reverend Immaculate Brazen-Faced Dr. Cheeky Cheney, QACK, quack, and ASS, ass, has come from New York to upset hell and give us back paradise.
New title, Quack Ass.
And basically making fun of his, the zodiac and the lectures he's giving, and the lectures in which he is going to upset hell and prove all biblical character and prophecies to have an astronomical origin or reference. And it concludes This is an insult to San Francisco. Well, Cheney ends up moving there, as does Flora Wellman. And while they're there, he marries Flora Wellman, and she gets pregnant, and they start actually publishing a spiritualist new age newspaper in San Francisco. And of course, San Francisco then, we're talking the 1870s, is as much a bohemian, free-thinking community as any place in the U.S. It was then, it is now still. And they're right in the thick of that. Well, she tells Cheney that she's pregnant. And he says, get an abortion. And she refuses. And so he dumps her. He leaves her. And she goes to the newspapers. She's not afraid of saying, this guy got me pregnant and dumped me. And the newspapers jump on him, and he's basically hounded out of town. I mean, he's still in town, but, he is a pariah after this. So it's interesting because he has all these unconventional ideas and blasphemous ideas that sort of sets him up for criticism. But people don't really get mad at him until he violates the honor of marriage, the honor of, getting a woman pregnant and taking responsibility for it. And so Flora marries an older man, John London, and names her baby Jack London.
There we go.
So there we go. So essentially a match is made in Seattle at the Yeslers' home. It's consummated in San Francisco, and Jack London is the result. Now, Cheney denied that he was the father. He said Flora was a loose woman. She slept with lots of guys. It could have been somebody else. Nobody believed that. Jack London is not told who his real father is. He thinks John London, this older man, is his real father until later, after John London is dead, and his mother, Flora, tells him, no, it's this other guy. And he's devastated by this. It's a big, upsetting fact in his life. Cheney wants nothing to do with him and, moves to Chicago and continues his, astrological career.
Seattle has so many strange and unexpected origin stories when it comes to famous people. They seem to just kind of pop up all over the place. Did Jack London ever come to Seattle?
Yeah, he did visit Seattle, but later on, when once he was famous, he came and lectured here, and he was also very much connected with the Klondike Gold Rush, Call of the Wild, and he was in Port Townsend, in some of his early rambling days. I'm sure he came through Seattle. In many ways, Jack London, it was interesting because, of course, Jack London had unconventional ideas as well in terms of, he was a socialist and proud of it at a time when they were, he wrote a lot of socialist tracts and promoted that political cause at the very time it was becoming anathema to the mainstream. In the meantime, the Yeslers move. They build this enormous mansion. Henry dies eventually. He was, mayor of Seattle, involved in all kinds of business and real estate, whatnot. And he's the first Seattle-made millionaire, basically. And so they donate the house, this big mansion, to be the home of a true public library. So they've been lobbying, saying, look, this library needs to be a public. We can't just go from one private club to another. We need a bona fide public library, and that's what civilized cities have. They have public libraries. The taxpayers should be paying for this.
Where was the mansion?
Not that far from where the actual library is now. And it was only there for a couple of years. There's some photographs of it with a public library sign outside. And it burned. It burned. The building burned. And they were able to rescue a lot of the books. And so then the issue was, we've got to build a new library. We've got to build a public library. And that's where they decide to build on this lot at 4th and Madison. and where it still is.
The Beaux-Arts building in 1906.
Yes. And it's interesting because the guy who was at that time the head librarian made this pitch for the need for a public library that I thought was really interesting, because he basically says, in so many words, the city's basest interests should not be where we derive our benefits. He's basically saying, look, this town is built on prostitution, saloons, gambling. Seattle was just like lots of frontier towns into the 1890s, the period where they're trying to get the library established. This is a city that's built on the wreckage of lives. Shouldn't we spend some money to uplift the community in a way that isn't so tainted with, taxing bordellos and that kind of thing? And that argument succeeds. Essentially that succeeds. And they were able then to appeal to Andrew Carnegie for funds to help fund a library. And that happened. And we've had a, major public library ever since.
Knut, do you think there's something about the story of the Yeslers and our other founders that resonates to how Seattle has turned out and Seattle culture, social culture through the ages? We've never been a church-going city. That's the one thing that has always been said about Seattle. We have the lowest church attendance of any city our size in the country.
Yeah, I think that there is an element of that. I think people in Seattle, the fact that the Yeslers could have such unconventional ideas and still be accepted in the community, I think says a lot. I think that's an ethic that's continued in Seattle, but it's one that always bumps up against the sort of middle-classization of the city, the bourgeois elements of Seattle, which not necessarily religiously, but become very intolerant of difference. But the overall civic culture is both one that strives to be better. We're proud of our arts. We're proud of town hall. We're proud of our independent political thinking. I think people do feel they have a certain intellectual freedom here. And I think that was something about Seattle that was very appealing from early on. You can come here and you're not tied down to New England, or you can come here and you're not tied down to the Catholic Church, or you're not tied down to whatever. And I think that some of those traditions carry on in the city, as does money making. Henry Yesler was in some ways as bad or as good as any capitalist that has been in town.
But there was a civic mindedness on the part of Sarah and Henry.
Yes.
They gave. They did things.
They did things. And they did things early on. So not only the library, but, the cookhouse became a gathering place for civic activity. And then when the cookhouse was torn down, they built Yesler Hall, which was like town hall. It was across the street. It was the civic gathering place that was for a more respectable city, So it was a rough and tumble community, and a community that in many ways needed fixing. And they were part of the fixing, but also part of the unruliness and diversity of thought.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. The video series is now in its 11th season. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this or any season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. And now, if you prefer to watch your podcasts, you're in luck. Head to YouTube to see a brand new video version of the Mossback podcast. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Studio recording and setup by Resti Bacall, Victoria Ralph, Roger Basquette, Lucy Barrera, Yamina Stiet, and Matt Broad. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, join the members who make Mossback's Northwest possible. Your donation will help fund the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, local news, and more. Plus, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Go to cascadepbs.org/membership to sign up today. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.